So, welcome back everyone to the Anvil. Today we're going to be talking about the spectrum of strength and different types of muscle action and how each of them factor into the training process that you're going through. Now, it looks pretty complicated with this diagram here. This was taken from a very famous book in my line of work called Super Training by Professor Yuri Verkhoshansky. And basically, it summarizes all the different fitness components and how they relate to strength. So the things that we're familiar with, that you'll have heard of before, like stamina, speed, that type of thing, how does it factor into strength? And to be honest with you, the reason why I always start with this is strength is probably the most misunderstood fitness component that's out there. Everyone seems to be aware of things like stamina and what that entails, and endurance and, balance and even flexibility. But when people are asked what strength is, they immediately go to the bodybuilders and the powerlifters of the world and not understand that strength can be manifested or expressed in several different ways. And within that, we need to have at least a basic understanding of muscle physiology and how different muscles act on the skeletal system. So, to start with, first of all, what is strength? Simply, strength is the ability to exert force. It's typically manifested against an external resistance, so in the form of a weight, but it can also be your body weight as well. Within that, strength can also be defined based off its rate, its magnitude, and its direction and its movement. And all that means is how fast are you expressing that strength, how much do you have to express? So what is the magnitude? What is the overall amount of force that you have to express? What direction is it? So there are three biomechanical planes that we exist within. There is sagittal plane, which is everything that occurs front to back. There is frontal plane, everything that occurs side to side. And then transverse plane, everything that occurs within a rotational capacity. So what direction is that force being applied within? And then finally, you have the movement. So as we've talked about, there are 9 key movement categories: the squat, the hinge, the unilateral exercise category, some form of loaded carry, triple extension, horizontal push and pull, and vertical push and pull. So what movement are we expressing that within? So it's simply, like I said, the ability to exert force. Within that, we also have other fitness components such as skill, endurance and speed. Obviously there are a few more, particularly things like flexibility, but this diagram behind me simply just shows how strength is linked to each of those components. And the beauty of strength is, as I've said before, it forms the foundation of all other fitness components, and therefore it is linked to all other fitness components. If you get stronger over time within this kind of process that we're talking about, where it's a marathon, not a sprint, you're constantly looking to improve that physical capacity within your body, all the other fitness components will improve as well. So let's just go around each in turn, and just give a brief definition as well as an example of each of those forms of strength. So, simply put, strength on its own is typically manifested in what's known as maximal strength, so the ability to exert high amounts of force. An example of this would be a deadlift, a 1 rep max deadlift, powerlifting, that type of sport where it's focused purely on not the speed, so not the rate that it's applied within, and very limited direction, so we're controlling that. They all occur within the sagittal plane, but how much force can you apply? Number 2, strength speed. This is basically when we get heavy weights that have to be moved at fast, velocities. An example of this would be Olympic weightlifting, if you've ever seen that. So it's the one where there are 2 exercises: the clean, where they bring it up to the chest and press it overhead, and then the snatch, where they take it from the floor, overhead in one fluid motion. So that is heavy weights, so a higher magnitude force that have to be moved in a very rapid rate. Speed strength. An example of this that I like to use is, it's more on the power spectrum, It's like when you throw a punch within boxing, or if you go for a rugby tackle within the sport of rugby and American football, that type of thing. You are trying to exert massive amounts of force, but the rate is more important within that. For speed, simply put, 100 meter sprint, everyone knows that. It's trying to move as fast as you possibly can. So then we move on to endurance. So what is endurance? It's the ability to sustain repeated bouts of an activity. Now that activity can change over time, or it can be something that is relatively monotonous and repetitive in nature, such as running. And it's the ability to, like I said, maintain that. Now, the task can also be static in nature as well. So we have 2 different types of each of these fitness components, to be fair, but particularly within the world of endurance, we actually have static and dynamic positions that we can be in. So you can be statically strong, okay, which is when, like I've said, the planes of movement that you move within are limited, okay, or you can be dynamically strong, where there's a few more phases going on. Within endurance, it's the same thing. So a classic example of static endurance is the ability to maintain postural position. It's that simple, okay? It happens every single day, and we don't even realize it's taking place, but the muscles have to have some degree of endurance to be able to maintain that postural position. Dynamic endurance, like I said, would be something like running. So we obviously have speed endurance. It's linked to that. So an example of speed endurance would be something like a 400-meter sprint versus a 100-meter sprint. We're still looking to try and get as fast as possible, but it's over a sustained period of time. Then we go into strength endurance, okay? So what is that? A classic example of strength endurance, if you've ever watched World's Strongest Man, or if you are a strongman athlete yourself, then any dynamic event, so any event in which they are moving with weight, farmers walks, yokes, loading medleys, all these different types of things, you need a high degree of strength endurance to be good at those events, as well as strength, speed, and so on. Then we've got skill, okay, so how does skill factor in? Now, if you haven't already, I would strongly recommend that you go and watch the learning exercise technique video, where we talk about the underlying psychology and science behind learning different skills. But ultimately, skill is referred to the coordination of the neuromuscular system to express some form of movement or express one of these fitness qualities. And skill is something that can be refined completely separate to all of these other components, where you're just focusing on individual parts that will ultimately make up the whole. So how does skill again factor in with all of these? Well, to be honest with you, there is a big link between the two. So for example, strength skill is very, very important within the world of powerlifting and Olympic weightlifting. There's a lot of stuff that's done on technique, but for most people, I don't necessarily focus on that. I treat skill as an entirely separate thing. So we don't necessarily need to cover that in too much detail today. And then finally, flexibility or mobility, okay? Most people look at that as just stretching, and they would be right within some degree. You have static flexibility, the ability to, take your arms overhead, can you touch your toes and so on. But we also have dynamic flexibility, which is also known as mobility nowadays. This diagram was created a few decades ago. But mobility is basically your body's ability to put itself in that position by using different muscles. So for example, how low can you squat and so on. And flexibility in particular is linked to all of them, but especially within strength. As we've said before, range of motion is a key factor when it looks to progressing different exercises. So we want to have the highest degree of flexibility possible while still being able to maintain a strong, stable position. So just to summarise, like I said, this is a diagram that links each fitness component together, with strength being at the top because it's arguably the most important one. So why is it important to be aware of all of these? Simply put, it's important because at different stages of training, as well as different exercises, will all vary over time to make sure that we are moving within this spectrum. And you basically exist, or your training process exists within this kind of diagram. So let's say you are someone who is completely brand new to training, you've never lifted before, okay? We're not going to place you up here in the strength position. You'll be more around here, where we're focusing on getting you stronger, but we are also working on the skills and trying to refine the exercise technique. Let's say you are a sprinter, okay, and we are 12 weeks out from an event that you've got where you need to be as fast as possible. We're not going to start those 12 weeks down here in speed. We're going to do a needs analysis, assess you as an individual by using the 4S model like we've talked about in a separate video, using the 4S model to make sure that we're on the right track, okay? And we might start for you as an individual working on your endurance, okay, and then working towards flexibility, shifting up towards strength, and then working down the strength speed spectrum towards speed. So basically, let's take the final example of a strongman, okay? A strongman comes to me, wants to work, compete within the under 105 kilo category, okay, so about 16, 17 stone. We know there that they need to have a lot of static strength, but also a few of the events are very dynamic in nature. That individual comes to work with me, they have a 250 kilo squat, 300 kilo deadlift, and they can press 120 kilos over the head. I don't need that individual necessarily, particularly at that stage, to focus on working on maximal strength. What they need instead, because that's probably where the weakness will lie for most individuals, because they tend to be one or the other, is in strength endurance, okay, particularly more around the mobility side of things, and working on speed strength. So this is the spectrum that literally anyone who works with me, when I assess your program, I assess your consultation and work through designing the training program, one of the processes after assessing your movement quality is I'll literally have this diagram on my wall in my office, okay, and have above that the training loads and whatnot, and we will decide where your training needs to be prioritized. So it's just important for you guys to be aware of this, because ultimately, if you feel like you need to work on one of these fitness components more than the other, if you have an understanding of how they link together, you can fire a message over to me and we'll be able to discuss it within the spectrum of this kind of training design. And then finally, different types of muscle action. Why are they important and why do we need to be aware of them? Okay, so on a pretty simplistic basis, there are a few more levels of depth that we can go to with this, but you only really need to be aware of 3 different types of muscle action: eccentric, isometric, and concentric. Now, eccentric is when we lower a weight. So let's say this was a weighted implement. We're in a bicep curl. As I lower that weight down, this muscle is under tension. It is lengthening under tension. So that is eccentric. Isometric is, let's say I'm lowering it down and then I stop it and I hold it in position. Okay, so when the muscle action is working, muscle tension is increasing to maintain that position, but the joint isn't changing angle. So there's no actual movement taking place. And then concentric is when we lift the weight. So the term lifting weights only really refers to that phase. It's important to be aware of this because our underlying physiology gears us up to be very, very strong in one area, eccentrically, and pretty weak in the other areas, concentrically. And we're somewhere in the middle with isometrics. So why is this the case? Well, simply put, all of our muscles, you have something known as muscle architecture, which is basically how the fibers within each individual muscle align with one another and how they pull on the tendons and so on. Okay, each individual muscle tends to be geared towards being very, very beneficial, or very, very strong rather, and efficient within eccentric contractions. On top of that, we also have certain inhibitory reflexes that reduce our capacity to produce force when we're lifting them because there's more strain placed on the tendon. And a couple of other neuromuscular factors such as activation of different motor units, which are the little plugs that switch a muscle on, okay, they're much more efficient within eccentric contractions. Now, there's some research as to whether or not this is down to evolutionary biology in terms of us needing to run. When we run, it's largely a process of eccentric movement. If you think about it, when you come off the ground and then you land again, you are having to absorb that impact each time, which classifies as an eccentric contraction every time you land from a jump. But it's not necessarily important, it's just important to be aware that we're stronger within this contraction. Isometric, that is the ability to maintain a strong static position. Now, this actually is one of the few areas where I'll break it down in a little bit more detail. There's also something known as quasi-isometric. Okay, it's not something that's talked about very often, but it's important to be aware of. Now, quasi-isometric is when the movement speed is so slow in nature, okay, that we don't necessarily get the same skill demand that we would have in sports like Olympic weightlifting. So, for example, when an individual goes for an absolute maximum deadlift, okay, when an individual, if you've ever watched World's Strongest Man again, when they start the truck pull and they're pulling and pulling and pulling, the movement is very, very slow. Okay, the skill component is so low and the speed component is so low that it actually falls more from a neuromuscular standpoint into the realms of isometric training. And then finally, concentric is when, like I said, we lift the weight. So the reason we're so weak within this is pretty much all of the joints within our body are inefficient levers. Okay, versus the ankle, for example, it's the one efficient lever within our body where we can actually produce a significant amount of force to be able to lift ourselves. So it's not uncommon to see people that can't squat 100 kilograms can calf raise 300 kilograms because that joint is very, very strong. So why do we need to be aware of each of them? Well, going back to this diagram up here, nice and simple. We're not going to go into too much detail. We're going to have a couple of questions at the end anyway to make sure that you dig a little bit deeper and ask any questions that you've got. But basically, when we're looking at improving skills, okay, and also working on our maximal strength, eccentric contractions are the way forward. There's research to show, as I think I've mentioned in one of the other videos, but there's research to show that biofeedback from the muscle to the brain in terms of things like joint position, speed, control, everything like that, is higher during an eccentric contraction than any other form of muscle action. So it's just important that we keep that in mind. When you're learning how to squat or learning how to do a unilateral exercise, for example, we will tell you to keep the tempo lower, tempo much slower on the way down so that we get that greater feedback from a skill component. Isometric, the deadlift, Okay, if you haven't already, you'll be able to watch the deep dive into the deadlift video where we talk about the fact that the absolute most important factor within the deadlift is overcoming the inertia of the weight, in which a quasi-isometric contraction is required. So being strong off the floor within an isometric setting, okay, is more important within some schools of thought, is more important than the ability to just move weight from A to B. And then concentric, ultimately, the ability to express power, which is something which is basically force times velocity. It's strength expressed within a very, very quick manner. It's manifested itself more within concentric movements. So when you lift a weight, that's when we really express power. Easiest way to think of that is when you jump. You can't really be powerful on the way down with things. I know that sounds kind of obvious, but it's on the concentric contraction where we express power. So the final thing that we need to be aware of, okay, from an underlying physiology standpoint, if you've stuck with me so far, well played, because it is quite in-depth and dry when we talk about muscle physiology, but we also have something known as the Henman size principle, okay? Now, to put it really, really simplistic, every single muscle, okay, is charged by electrical energy. It's the central nervous system that sends impulses to the muscle. Now, within each muscle, you have what are known as motor units, which are basically little plugs like this, okay, that attach into the muscle. When the brain senses that there's a stimulus, i.e. a weight that we need to lift, it will send an impulse to that muscle and recruit those motor units. Now, the body, in its absolute infinite wisdom, over millions of years of evolution, is very, very lazy, because ultimately energy conservation is the priority. Keeping us alive and stopping us from starving is more important than how well we can lift a weight. So we have a size order in which these motor units are recruited. If the body senses that the motor units don't need to switch on because the stimulus isn't that heavy, okay, or it isn't that demanding, it won't switch them on. So the larger motor units that produce the significant amounts of force won't really activate. And one of the key distinguishing factors that we find with people that are very, very strong, right the way down to people that are absolute beginners and have never lifted a weight before and are relatively weak, is the stronger person can recruit those larger motor units. Now, over time, as you start to get stronger and stronger, your body will realise and you will have volitional control of those motor units and be able to activate them when you want. Now, the example that I use for this, okay, really, really simple example, is I want you to, when you're next training or when you're in a gym or even now if you can, I want you to hold a heavy object in your hand, okay? Or you can hang from a pull-up bar. So it's just a grip test and we're just testing an isometric contraction. And I want you to hang for as long as you physically can, okay? If you get past 60 seconds, well played, because that's actually pretty strong, particularly within the dead hang position. But from there, next time you do it, I want you to do the same thing, but I want you to actively think about squeezing as hard as you can. Now you might be, but most people aren't even aware that when they hang, they use the absolute minimum amount of energy to do that. Okay, it's really, really common that one of the easiest ways to increase someone's strength in the farmer's walk within strongman, for example, is just telling them to squeeze harder. Same with the deadlift. People will grab the deadlift bar, go to lift the weight, and use the least amount of energy that they need to, because the body's a really efficient kind of entity, or a very efficient organism, sorry. So isometric and eccentric contractions, they serve to do one main thing, which is overload the central nervous system and teach the body to use those motor units. So you might be sitting there thinking, well, why do I have to do isometric training? I don't see anyone else, pulling against something that doesn't move. Ultimately, it's to get you in a position, get your body in a position where you can actually tap into what you've got, okay, and be able to express that. Because the injury risk is virtually non-existent within isometric training in particular. It allows you to exert a huge amount of force and teach the body that those inhibitory reflexes don't have to kick in, provided you're in the right position. And like I said, eccentric training gives you that skill feedback and also overloads those motor units. So, just to summarise, I know it's very, very dry, but it's important for everyone to understand. I find this absolutely fascinating, particularly with muscle physiology and motor units and whatnot. But just to summarise, we have strength, speed, endurance, and skill as like four main fitness components, particularly in reference to strength, and flexibility, sorry. And strength is the pinnacle of all of them, and it ties into each of them as well in turn. Then we have muscle physiology, three different main types of muscle action. Eccentric, isometric, concentric, and there are differing kind of effects to training each of those. So guys, I hope you enjoyed the discussion on the spectrum of strength and muscle physiology. Now I've just got three questions for you, okay? So one of them is going to be a test, okay, just to make sure that we digested a little bit of the information. And then the other two are just going to be questions that I want to incite a little bit of curiosity within you guys. So question number 1, can you give me an example, okay, of an exercise in which you express strength endurance? And then another example of strength speed, okay, and then another example of static endurance. So that's your questions. That's number 1, sorry. Number 2, can you think of any reasons why isometric training and eccentric training haven't been performed to the same degree within the gym setting now? So why is it that concentric training, lifting the weight, seems to be much more important than lowering the weight? There is no right or wrong answer with this one. I'm just genuinely interested in everyone's opinions. And then finally, number 3, is there any of those fitness components that we talked about that you tend to favour over another? So do you prefer training endurance over strength, or do you prefer working on your technique, or so on? Again, no right or wrong answer, I'm just genuinely curious on everyone's response.